Hi, it's Sebastian Stodolak, and this is Through Bastiat's Eye. What's the relation between political power and prosperity? This is the question we will try to answer in our talk with Professor Randall Holcombe, an economist from Florida State University. How are you doing, Professor?
I'm doing great, Sebastian. Thanks very much.
We just entered a lockdown here, but I heard that Florida is totally free. Is that correct?
That's correct. The government has no requirements that businesses are closed, schools are open. The governor of the state says, I'm not going to require any businesses to close. I'm not going to require that anybody be prohibited from working. So Florida's pretty open.
What about economic activity in Florida? Is it down? Is there a decline?
Well, it is down, and tourism is a big industry in Florida, and people are reluctant to travel. So there is there is tourism in Florida, and Florida's doing okay, but especially for international travel. We have a lot of international visitors in Florida, but not so much this year because it's difficult to travel. And just as a side note on that, these weeks where we're talking are spring break, and college students are coming into Florida en masse. In fact, the police are trying to disperse them because all the crowds of college students in Florida.
What's interesting is that, as Florida example tells us, not every ruler, not every governor, not every president in the world decided to use its power to limit our activities during pandemic. Poland decided to do it, but Florida or other US states or Sweden, they did not. How do you explain this divergence between the reaction of various governments, local or nation governments, in the context of pandemic?
Well, it's tough to explain in the sense that you have different political leaders making different decisions. But one thing I would note is people who enter politics typically love power. They love to tell other people what to do. And some people are a bit panicked about COVID. And so it gives government a chance to exercise its power. It gives people who are in charge the opportunity to tell other people what to do. But in the United States, I mean, it's a really interesting contrast between Florida and California, because California has all the lockdowns. See, in the United States, it's mostly done at a state level, not national level. So California, all these lockdowns, businesses are closed, people are not allowed to assemble. But Florida's governor has been very freedom-minded. You know, he said, anybody who, I'm not going to require any businesses to close. I'm not going to tell anybody they can't work at their jobs. Restaurants are open, schools are open, everything's open.
Do Florida people support their governor?
Well,
what's the general impression here?
Yeah, he's had support. I think my general impression is, yes, people support the governor, but there are also vocal opponents. You know, people who are saying, well, you know, if we don't have lockdowns, we're killing people and so forth. So he does have his vocal opponents. And a lot of that's along political lines. The governor is a member of the Republican Party, and the criticism, a lot of it comes from Democrats. So it's interesting to see, but I think by and large, the governor has growing support because it was controversial to open up the state to not have lockdowns. But as we look at the results, really Florida's not doing worse than most states, and it's open.
Yeah, well, pandemic times are perfect laboratory of political power, I guess, and how various people exercise this power. So that leads us naturally to our main topic. In your book, Coordination, Cooperation, and Control, you write that when economic and political power are held by the same people, the result is stagnation. That's a quote from the beginning of your book. So please tell me, when was this time where economic and political power were separate things, because when I look back into history of mankind, it was almost always, very close to each other.
Sure, that's definitely the case. And I think around the time of the Enlightenment, so if we go back to the 1600s, the 1700s, and then the Industrial Revolution, that's when you see some separation of the people who hold economic power and political power. One of the things I do in the book is go way back in history to the beginning of the Agricultural Revolution, because I think by looking at that history, it really helps you to see why economic and political power tend to rest with the same people and how they ended up being separated. And people love power. People don't want to give up power. And so when you look at the separation of economic and political power as the Industrial Revolution takes place, it's not that some people who had power were giving it up, but rather people were able to create new economic power, people who didn't have political power. And so the separation came not because we had economic and political power that somehow became divided, but the people who had power, new economic power was created by others. So you look at, let's go back to the industrialists in the United States, and you think about people like John D. Rockefeller, who created Standard Oil, Andrew Carnegie, and U.S. Steel. Those were people who didn't have any political power. They were able to create new economic power, and it's that new economic power that enabled economic and political power to separate.
Well, that's an interesting perspective, because, today, when we hear from an economist this notion of economic power or of market power, it's mostly in a negative context. All these big tech companies, they exercise their economic power over us and over governments. Corporate power is getting stronger, so corporations can overcome obstacles, that governments put on their way, and they, for example, can ignore tax codes of specific countries. So mostly this economic power today by the mainstream is understood as something not very good, not very positive. And your perspective is quite to the contrary.
Yeah, let me make two points on that. And the first is the way I'm looking at economic power, it's not the same as market power.
Mm-hmm.
So market power exists when somebody has a monopoly or monopsony power, and economic power, the way I'm looking at it, is control over resources. So the more resources that you control, the more economic power you have. So, for example, you might be the only grocery store in a small town. So you have a lot of market power. You're a monopolist. If people want groceries, they have to go to your store. But you don't have very much economic power because you're in a small town. You don't control very much in the way of resources. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, take companies like Toyota or General Motors. Those are companies that have a lot of economic power. They control a lot of resources, but they don't have very much market power in that the auto industry is pretty competitive. So this goes back to a term that John Kenneth Galbraith discussed, countervailing power. So you have big companies with a lot of economic power, that is a lot of control over resources, but not much market power in the sense that they have monopolies over markets. I mean, General Motors, Toyota, Ford, Honda, these are companies that are all competing with each other, don't have much market power. So that's one point that I would want to make. And a second point that I'll make is you gave the example of companies with a lot of economic power manipulating tax codes and so forth. And what's happening there is companies can use their economic power to buy into political power. So it's not their economic power their activities in the market. Rather, they're using the resources they have to buy into political power. And this is one of the dangers. I mean, if we get economic power and political power separated, how do we keep them separated? And that's a problem, because people who have economic power might want to buy political influence to recombine economic and political power.
Well, that's actually what is happening all around the world. What is your say judgment here on the current state of affairs? On one hand, we have Western countries that are theoretically democracies with a separate political class that is regulating the economic class, but in reality it's the constant rotation between economics, between economy and the politics. For example, in Asia we have countries that are nominally kind of connected in terms of relation between economic and political power, like China is mostly the same. In order to be a great capitalist in China, you just have to sign in to the party. That's that's no brainer there. So what is your opinion here? Where are we on the map, on the scale between total separation and total unification, political and economic power?
Yeah, Sebastian, I think we're somewhere in the middle there. A lot of people we exercise economic power in the market by engaging in voluntary exchanges, and that's been a way for individuals to prosper since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So we see a lot of that. We see new firms that are emerging all the time. I mean, you take some of the giants that people are concerned about now, firms like Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Apple. You go back half a century ago and those firms didn't even exist. And they made their way by exercising economic power. But see, one of the problems that we face, we always have to be on our guard. Let's go back to this idea of creative destruction that Joseph Schumpeter talked about. Creative destruction is a great way for people who want to get ahead to get ahead. New ideas, new firms emerge and push aside the old firms and the old ideas. So creative destruction, that's a process that really works to the advantage of people who want to get ahead. But it's a process that works to the disadvantage of people who are already ahead, who want to stay ahead. So you have this continuing process where people are engaging in economic activity to get ahead. But once they are ahead, they have the incentive to try to negotiate with government to keep their advantages, to create regulatory barriers to entry, to get tax benefits for themselves and subsidies and so forth. And I think the regulatory barriers to entry is really a big thing. That when companies manage to dominate the markets that they're in, well, they want to create regulatory barriers to entry in order to prevent new entrants from dislodging them from their positions.
Mm-hmm. You said that we are in the middle on the scale, but where are we going to? I mean, what's the direction we are moving?
I tend to be an optimist, and I've discussed this with some of my friends who think I'm overly optimistic, but I think that process of creative destruction is going to continue to work, and so we can ultimately prevent the combination of economic and political power. Not completely, because we do see the cronyism, we do see the corruption in countries all around the world. So I'm not saying two types of power are going to be completely separated, but I'll tell you, one source of optimism, maybe I'm relying too much on historical older books, but you go back to the 1940s and you look at Joseph Schumpeter's Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. And one often quoted line in that book, Schumpeter says, "Can capitalism survive? No, I don't think it can." That's what he said in the 1940s. You look at Friedrich Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, and the road to serfdom, according to Hayek, was socialism. So here we have two very impressive thinkers in Schumpeter and Hayek. Both were very pessimistic in the 1940s on the prospects of capitalism. And now, here we are 70, 75 years later, and the capitalist system is still working pretty well.
But
now,
maybe, maybe history is repeating itself. You in the United States have this great new program presented by President Biden, stimulus almost $2 billion. We in Europe also have our own stimulus in Brussels. It's called the Rebuild Plan, but also our country, or almost every European country by themselves are introducing their own little programs to rebuild the economy after the crisis. So, well, we can feel the spirit that was present in 30s of the 20th century, when also there was a lot of this state interventionism in play, and we all know how it ended.
Yeah, and well, if you say we all know how it ended, but how did it end? Well, look at the prosperity in the 1950s, the 1960s. So you could be very depressed in the 1930s, and then the 1950s, the 1960s, things are looking pretty good.
Provided you survived the war.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, I started teaching economics in the 1970s. And there was a decade where it was easy to be depressed. We had rising inflation, rising unemployment. In the United States, we had wage and price controls. We had lines at the gas pumps. And I don't know how much this was true in Europe, but in the United States, we would often hear the phrase, think small. Everybody's going to have smaller houses, smaller cars.
But wait, this is something that we are facing in Europe right now. The popularity of all those theories called degrowth, for example, or zero growth theories, right? We have to limit ourselves in order to do this or that, for example, to save the climate, to save us from pandemic happening again, and so on. So this is again the reality.
Yeah, and those ideas are really bigger in Europe than they are in the United States, although you see them coming over. But yeah, that's a little bit disturbing, because I see mostly in European academics, but ideas are crossing the ocean. At one time I thought a good criticism of some of these policies is, but it's going to slow economic growth. And the response that the green community gives you on that is, yes, it's going to slow growth. That's a good thing. They say, on the one hand, and this has to be a very first world answer, but on the one hand, they say, we already have plenty of stuff. We don't need more. Well, you can say that in Europe or in the United States. Places in Asia, places in Africa, that argument doesn't really hold up quite as well. We already have plenty of stuff. And then a follow-up on that is, all this production is trashing the environment. But actually, if you look at environmental indicators, in a lot of ways, the environment's getting cleaner, the environment's getting better. If you look at things like air pollution and those sorts of things. So yeah, I'm aware of those arguments, but I'm hoping that people like you and me and others like us, that there'll be enough pushback that we can continue the remarkable prosperity that we've seen since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
I'd like to ask you, because you said that in your book you go back to the times of Neolithic revolution, probably, right? To the very beginning of a civilization. Let me ask you about your theory of power. Is it something in our nature, something that evolution created in us, so we can never get rid of it? Or is it something accidental that happened throughout the history? At some point, we just discovered that we can rule other people, and we just stuck in this idea. So what is your opinion here? Evolution or accident?
No, I think it's just innate in human nature that people like to exercise power over other people. And I go way back in the book looking at history. And if you look at hunter-gatherer societies before the agricultural revolution, I mean, there's still some hunter-gatherer societies around, but you look at hunter-gatherer societies, and one of the keys to understanding the separation of economic from political power is the importance of particular factors of production. So in hunter-gatherer societies, you did have a bit of a power hierarchy, but the key factor of production was labor. And hunter-gatherer societies tend to be small, and if people abuse their power, so people who have power abuse it, others can leave. And when they leave, they take their labor with them. So the key factor of production, labor, you take it with you when you leave. And about 10,000 years ago or so, when the agricultural revolution came along, the key factor of production really shifted from labor to land. And so with the agricultural revolution, people had to stay in fixed areas. You're cultivating land, and it became difficult to leave. So people were attached to their land. So if the people who had power, basically power in those days was controlling the land. The people who controlled the land controlled the people on it. So sure, people could try to leave, but if they did, they couldn't take their land with them. So that tied people to the land, and it gave people who had control over the land control over political power. They had control over the people on the land and control over economic power. They controlled resources. So there's a pretty big shift from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural societies that allowed a lot more of the people who had power had a lot greater ability to control other people. And then, then a few hundred years ago, as trade increased, as commerce became more important relative to agriculture, the most important factor of production shifted from land to capital. And capital is much more mobile, and entrepreneurship is even more mobile. And so you had a situation where, as capital became more important, if people who had power were abusing it, the owners of capital could take their capital and go somewhere else.
So the moment where the capital was starting to dominate economic relation, was also the moment where this tension appeared between economic and political power, or was it always inherent in human relations?
Well, I think it's always inherent that people want to maintain power. And when land was the major factor of production, you got power by controlling the land. The control of the land, that gave you control over economic resources, and it gave you control over the people who were on the land. But as capital became more important as a factor of production, capital can move. Capital is mobile. And you know, if it's capital in terms of goods and services or transportation, you know, ships and that sort of thing, very mobile. If capital is in the form of, say, factories, it's hard to move your factory, but factories depreciate. So over time, if oppressive governments, oppressive people with political power are exercising that power over the owners of factories, well, eventually those factories depreciate, new factories emerge in other places. So it's the mobility of capital that allowed the separation of economic from political power. But again, I'll emphasize, it wasn't taking economic power away from people who had it. It was creating new economic power. People who didn't have political power were able to create new economic power, and that's what allowed that separation.
But if you know, if the will to rule is something inherent to our nature, then we can assume that we can never eradicate the political power, you know, like completely, right? So there'll be never a moment where you know, this anarcho-capitalist dream will come true.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's always that danger, right? Because the people who have political power want to exercise it over other people. So what we need to do is to figure out, how can we create governments that have enough power to protect our rights, but don't have enough power to violate our rights. So you see that idea in, for example, in the Constitution of the United States, which creates a limited government with limited powers, and the power that people have in the United States, the political power that people have in the United States, the political power that people have in Europe, that power rests with the position, not with the person. So President Biden has a lot of power. But why? Well, it's not because he's Joe Biden. It's because he's the president of the United States. Donald Trump used to have a lot of power, but he doesn't have that power anymore. The power lies with the position. But people in power would like to keep that power to themselves. So in contrast to President Trump, President Biden, look at Vladimir Putin in the USS or in Russia, right, where he's democratically elected, but he's managed to shift that power from the position of the presidency to his own personal power. He's managed to change the laws so that now he can stay in office in perpetuity. Same thing is true of President Xi in China, where those people are taking the power of the position and they're successfully transferring it to themselves as individuals. That's a big threat. And so a situation like that, we see the recombination of economic and political power.
When we are speaking of all those things, we are assuming that there's this dichotomy between government and the private actors or the market. And, you know, that begs a question because a lot of people who say, no, you know, this old classical liberalism is old and it's not valid anymore because today governments and markets are not separate things and they cannot be separate because they are kind of self-reinforcing. Good government helps the market to develop and the market helps the government to be better. So this dichotomy market government is artificial. What would you say to that kind of arguments? Are they correct?
Well, I think there are certain properties of government that enhance market activity. And the key things are rule of law and protection of property rights. So you can't have a thriving economy without protection of property rights because nobody has an incentive to be productive if what they produce can just be taken away from them. So protection of property rights, and then rule of law, where everybody's governed by an objective set of laws that's designed to protect people's rights rather than to favor one set of individuals over another. Now it's difficult to maintain that separation because both the economic elite and the political elite want to try to overturn it. The political elite, they're looking to the economic elite for resources to maintain their power, and the economic elite, they're looking to government for protections, for barriers to entry, for special advantages. So, I mean, it's a difficult thing to maintain. And the first step in maintaining it is recognizing why it's important. I think it's one of the things we saw with Enlightenment idea. You look at the Enlightenment, and before the Enlightenment ideas, people were subjects of their government. And, you know, the idea was that the subjects of government, their obligation was to carry out the mandates of their government, to do what's in the best interest of their governments. And Enlightenment ideas overturned that. You know, with Enlightenment ideas, the idea was government serves the people rather than people serving the government. So we need to reinforce that message. You know,
but when you say that government can do things to enhance market activities, like protecting private property, you refer to this idea of minimal government. Like Robert Nozick promoted for minarchism, it's called, I guess. But today, those defenders of the government, they say, government needs to do a lot more. First of all, it needs to redistribute. Second, it needs to invest. It needs to protect people from this or that. It needs to engage into some coordinated activities with other government to, prevent some collapse or disasters from happening. And well, there is the social component in all of it, because society tends to support interventionism because it's an easy solution, right? I mean, it gives you people who are trying to solve your problems, rather than sticking to this very, say, not clear idea that some entrepreneur will find a solution to climate change in the future, so don't worry, because this is this very often repeated narrative among free market people, like don't worry, look back, all the problems of mankind were solved, and people were always afraid that they would not be solved. They were solved, so don't worry, look in the future with a smile, because all be good, it'll be all okay. So the thing is that society supports politicians because it needs some kind of certainty, right? So there's virtually infinite number of socially appealing arguments you can make in favor of interventionism, of the government doing this or that. And what can free market people offer, to the society? What kind of arguments that will actually convince them that we need to, keep economic and government power, political power separate?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's a tough sell because people want government to take care of them. I mean, we complain about the nanny state sometimes, but a lot of people like the nanny state. Yeah, let the government take care of me. But I think one powerful argument is to ask people, would you rather make your own decisions for yourself, or do you want other people to decide for you? Do you want to take control of your own life? Or do you want somebody else to take control of your life for you? And so if you start from that idea, most people are going to say, no, I don't want other people making my decisions for me. And so I think that's a start of convincing people about classical liberal ideas.
Mm-hmm. And let me ask you as a, I guess, final question, because I guess it's also kind of bias among many free market people that they tend to neglect the wrongdoings by the private actors. Because, for example, rent seeking, many free market people say, well, rent seeking is just another fault of government, because if not for the government intervention, we would not have reason for rent seeking, right? This theory of stick, if the bees are doing their business, and if you keep away from them, they're doing their business. If you go and try to beat them with a stick, they will fly over you. They will try to bite you. So, well, maybe that's true, but maybe it takes two to tango, right? So there is also this tendency among business people to try to bribe politicians, to try to grab privileges for themselves. Do you think that requires criticism? I mean, some kind of special address on the side of free market people, that phenomenon?
Yeah, well, you don't find very many free market people who defend rent seeking and the special interest politics.
Yeah, but they say it's government fault.
Well, it's the fault of government institutions. I mean, what you want to do is to try to create an institutional structure where it's not possible to engage in rent seeking. I think that's a big challenge. But if you have limited government with limited ability for rent seeking opportunities, then people who are looking for profits, well, you got to go and sell your products to people in the market. But this is one of the dangers of big government. The bigger government is, the more favors it can give out to other people. And so, I guess you can fault business people for approaching government to try to get favors, engaging in rent seeking. But the reason they do it is because the opportunities are there. So
they're taking their chances, right?
Yeah, and I mean, certainly, if you're a supporter of the free market, you don't like to see businesses that are rent seeking. But the way to go about doing that isn't to chastise the businesses, it's to close the ability for firms to engage in rent seeking, close the ability for them to get government favors.
If you were to point at one country around the globe that is the closest one to this ideal balance between economic and political power?
Oh, that's a tough question. You know, I mean, I really think I would put the United States pretty high on the list there. You know, maybe Switzerland. I mean, the problem is every country you look at, these problems are arising. The rent seekers, the regulatory capture, that sort of thing. And one reason why I might put the United States higher on the list than European countries is that the overall size of government is smaller in the United States. And the smaller government is, the less the government has the ability to provide these special interest benefits.
So the size of the government would be a good proxy of this correct balance.
Yeah, I think it's one indicator. I mean, if you're looking at government interference in the economy, one way to think about it is to divide the functions of government into the budgetary state and the regulatory state. And so the budgetary state, that's size of government. And the smaller the budgetary state, smaller government spending, the more economic freedom you're going to have. But also there's that threat of the regulatory state. So you need to look at government regulations. And I think the United States fares relatively well there also. Although Scandinavian countries fare, well, better than the United States probably. You look at Sweden, you look at... So, Sweden has a big budgetary state, but a more limited regulatory state than the United States.
So the situation is quite nuanced here.
Right.